Imagine it's a bitterly cold morning, January 30th, 1649. The air in London is thick with frost and an even thicker tension. A king, believed by many to be chosen by God, is about to walk to his own death, not in a battlefield ambush or by a poisoner's hand, but by the legal order of his own people. We've all heard the basic story. King Charles I was executed, a pivotal moment in the English Civil War. But what if the story you know is just a sanitized headline? What if the reality of that day, the sights, the sounds, the raw human details was far more calculated, personal, and brutal than the history books ever let on? Forget the simple tale of a king losing his head. Today, we uncover the chilling step-by-step reality of the day England committed the ultimate taboo and executed its own monarch. Before the axe ever fell, there was a trial unlike any other in history. For the first time, a reigning monarch was subjected to a court of law established by his own subjects. Picture the scene in Westminster Hall. 135 commissioners were appointed as judges, though only 68 ever showed up, a sign of the deep division and fear gripping the nation. At the center of it all was King Charles I. But he wasn't there to plead for his life. From the moment he entered, he radiated an aura of regal defiance. When the charge of tyranny, treason, and murder was read out, he didn't offer a defense. Instead, he repeatedly challenged the court's very existence. He famously asked, "I would know by what power I am called hither. By what authority, I mean, lawful." He believed his authority came from God, the divine right of kings, and no earthly court could ever judge him. This wasn't just a legal defense, it was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Charles's defiance was a calculated performance. He knew his fate was likely sealed, but he was determined to control the narrative. He refused to remove his hat, a sign of disrespect to the court, but a clear message that he did not recognize their authority over him. His accusers, led by Solicitor General John Cook, laid out a case detailing his crimes against the people of England, blaming him for the immense bloodshed of the Civil War. Yet, with every accusation, Charles remained resolute. He wasn't just a man fighting for his life, he was a king fighting for the very principle of monarchy. To him, this trial was an illegal circus, an act of rebellion against God's natural order. His refusal to plead turned the proceedings into a political spectacle. The court couldn't get the confession or the legal submission it wanted, so they were forced to proceed on the basis that his silence was an admission of guilt. This act of silent rebellion would become the first step in his journey from failed king to royal martyr. After days of this standoff, the verdict was inevitable. On January 27, the court declared Charles I guilty and sentenced him to death. Now came the most terrifying moment for the judges, signing the death warrant. This wasn't an abstract political decision, it was a personal act of regicide, the killing of a king. Each man who put his name to that document was marking himself for life. 59 commissioners ultimately signed it. The most prominent signature belonged to Oliver Cromwell, the driving force behind the parliamentarian victory. Legends claim that Cromwell had to bully and threaten others to sign, and that after signing, he playfully flicked ink at another commissioner's face, a moment of grim, nervous humor in the face of an earth-shattering act. That piece of parchment, now bearing 59 signatures, was the most dangerous document in England. It sealed the king's fate and set in motion the final, brutal act of the revolution. The hours leading up to the execution were filled with poignant, humanizing details. Charles spent his final night at St. James's Palace, reportedly sleeping soundly. On the morning of the 30th, he rose early. The weather was so intensely cold that he made a specific, and now famous, request. He asked for a second shirt. Why? He told his attendant, "The season is so sharp as probably may make me shake," which some observers may imagine proceeds from fear. "I would have no such imputation. I fear not death." He was meticulously stage managing his own death, ensuring that not even an involuntary shiver could be misinterpreted as cowardice. After receiving communion from his loyal bishop, William Juxon, he began his final journey. He walked under heavy guard across St. James's Park to the Palace of Whitehall, the very complex that housed the banqueting house, the site chosen for his execution. It was a slow, deliberate, and public walk, a final procession for a king whose reign was about to end in the most public way imaginable. The location of the execution was no accident. The scaffold was erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. This wasn't just any building, its magnificent ceiling, painted by Peter Paul Rubens, was a grand celebration of the divine right of kings, commissioned by Charles himself. To execute him there, right beneath the symbols of his absolute power, was the ultimate political statement. The scaffold itself was draped in black cloth. Staples were hammered into the wood around the block, allowing for ropes to be used to force the king's head down if he resisted. The executioners, whose identities were hidden by masks and false beards, were waiting. The crowd was immense, but they were kept at a distance by ranks of soldiers. This was crucial. It meant that while thousands could see the spectacle, very few would be able to hear the king's final words. Upon reaching the scaffold, Charles I was not a broken man. He appeared calm, dignified, and in control. He handed his hat and cloak to the bishop and began to deliver a prepared speech. But because of the ring of soldiers, his words were lost to the vast majority of the crowd. He spoke to those near him on the scaffold, defending his actions and his reign. He claimed he had always stood for the liberty and freedom of the people, but he defined that liberty very differently from Parliament. For him, liberty meant living under the rule of law, with a king and a House of Lords to govern, not a world where subjects ruled themselves. In his final moments, he was still the king, lecturing his people on governance. He concluded his speech by declaring himself a martyr of the people. He then spoke quietly with Bishop Juxon, uttering one final, cryptic word, "Remember." To this day, no one is certain what he meant for the bishop to remember. With his speech concluded, the final preparations began. Charles tucked his long hair into a white cap to ensure a clean strike from the axe. He took a moment to pray, then gave the signal to the executioner that he was ready. He laid his neck upon the low wooden block. There was an almost unbearable silence across the massive crowd. They were witnessing something that was, to them, unthinkable. The executioner, a professional likely paid extra for this grim task, raised the heavy axe. Despite rumors and later fictional accounts of a botched job, contemporary sources agree that the blow was swift and clean. With a single, brutal strike, the head of King Charles I was severed from his body. The axe fell, and in that instant, centuries of English tradition were shattered. The divine, untouchable body of the king had been violated and destroyed by his own subjects. What happened next is perhaps the most telling detail of the entire day. There was no cheer. There was no triumphant roar from the crowd celebrating the death of a tyrant. Instead, eyewitness accounts describe a sound that rippled through the thousands of onlookers, a deep, collective groan. It was a sound of profound shock, horror, and perhaps even regret. The reality of what had just happened settled upon them. One spectator wrote that it was a groan as I have never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. In the moments that followed, the soldiers struggled to control the scene. People surged forward, trying to get to the scaffold. Why? To dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. This wasn't just morbid curiosity. For some, it was to have a relic of a royal martyr. For others, it was a souvenir of a world-changing event. The execution was over, but the brutal spectacle was not. The executioner then picked up the severed head. In a moment of high drama, he was supposed to hold it up and declare, "Behold the head of a traitor." However, reports from the day are confused. Some say he did, some say he didn't say the full line, and some say he showed it to the crowd silently. The shock was so profound that even this traditional part of an execution became muddled. What followed was even more macabre. The king's body was placed in a coffin, and his head was sewn back on by an embalmer. This was done to allow for a semblance of a dignified burial. The ultimate act of rebellion had been committed, but even the revolutionaries felt compelled to restore the physical integrity of the king's body. He was no longer a king, but he was not yet just a man. He was a symbol, and even in death, his body was a battleground for meaning. Parliament had killed the king, but they could not kill the idea of the monarchy. In executing Charles, they inadvertently gave him his greatest victory. He was transformed from a flawed, defeated monarch into a powerful martyr. His execution horrified many in England and across Europe. The short-lived English Republic, or Commonwealth, that followed was fraught with instability and military rule under Cromwell. The public grew tired of the strict Puritan laws and political chaos. The memory of the martyred king began to loom large. Just 11 years later, in 1660, the monarchy was restored, and Charles I's son returned from exile to be crowned King Charles II. The first thing the new king did was hunt down every man who had signed his father's death warrant. The surviving regicides were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a fate far more gruesome than the one they had given their king. The execution of Charles I was meant to end an era, but instead, it guaranteed that his legacy, and the monarchy itself, would never truly die. The execution of King Charles I wasn't just a political act, it was a raw, visceral, and deeply personal event that scarred the English psyche for generations. From the king's calculated defiance and his request for a second shirt, to the horrifying groan of the crowd, the details reveal a story far more complex than a simple tale of a tyrant getting what he deserved. It was a moment that redefined a nation, proving that no one, not even a king appointed by God, was above the reach of his people. What part of this story shocked you the most? Do you see Charles I as a stubborn tyrant who caused a civil war, or as a noble martyr who died for his principles? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dive into the dark side of history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories that the history books leave out, and share this